In November 1941, over 1,000 German prisoners of war arrived in Australia expecting a primitive colonial backwater with scarce resources and basic facilities. Instead, they stepped off the ship to find industrial cranes lifting 15 tons at a time, refrigerated warehouses stretching over 400 meters, and a single harbor operation that rivaled anything they'd seen in Hamburg or Bremen. Within weeks, these battle-hardened Afrika Korps veterans and U-boat crews were eating more meat in 7 days than their families back in Germany saw in a month, working in factories that matched the output of the Ruhr Valley and watching ice cream and Coca-Cola trucks roll into their POW camps like it was nothing. So what did these German soldiers, who'd been told they were fighting to save civilization from weak, degenerate democracies, actually think when they realized the primitive colony had already built what the Third Reich was desperately trying to conquer the world to achieve? Europe was burning. Nazi Germany controlled almost the entire continent. From the frozen forests of Norway to the sunny beaches of Greece, the swastika flag flew over conquered lands. In North Africa, General Rommel's tanks were pushing forward, winning battle after battle. Out in the Atlantic Ocean, German submarines called U-boats were sinking hundreds of Allied ships every month. The Nazi war machine seemed unstoppable. Their propaganda ministers told the German people they were winning because they were superior. They said the British Empire was weak and falling apart. They said democracies were soft and could never match German strength and discipline. Australia sat on the other side of the world, 12,000 miles away from the fighting in Europe. It was a young nation with only 7,300,000 people living across an entire continent. The country was so far from anywhere that many Germans had never even thought about it. When they did, Nazi propaganda painted a clear picture. Australia was primitive. Australia was just farms and deserts. Australia depended completely on Britain for protection. Australia had almost no industry and no real military power. It was the weakest part of the British Empire, a backwater colony that could barely defend itself. German soldiers were told that if Australia was ever attacked, it would fall in weeks. The German prisoners who boarded the transport ships heading to Australia believed every word of this propaganda. These were not inexperienced troops. Among the 1,026 men in the first transport were hardened veterans from the Afrika Korps who had fought under Rommel in the desert. There were U-boat crew members who had survived the dangerous cat and mouse games in the Atlantic. Some had been captured in North Africa. Others had been pulled from the ocean when their submarines were sunk. They were tired, defeated, and far from home. But they thought they knew what to expect. They were being sent to the edge of the world, to a place with limited food, basic camps, and primitive conditions. After all, if Britain itself was struggling with rationing and shortages, how could a distant colony possibly have anything better? The journey took weeks. The prisoners stayed below deck most of the time, packed into cramped quarters with little fresh air. They played cards. They talked about home. Some wondered if they would survive the war. Others planned what they would do when Germany won and they could return as heroes. A few whispered doubts, but most stayed quiet. You did not question the Reich, even as a prisoner. The ships sailed across the Indian Ocean through waters that were strange and unfamiliar. Finally, after endless days at sea, they approached the coast of Australia. On a grey morning in November, the transport ship entered Sydney Harbour. The prisoners were brought up on deck in groups, blinking in the bright sunlight. They lined the rails, looking out at the approaching coastline. The first thing they saw was the harbor itself, and immediately something felt wrong. This was not the primitive outpost they expected. The harbor stretched wide and deep, filled with dozens of ships. But it was not just the number of vessels that shocked them. It was the infrastructure supporting them. Massive cranes lined the wharves, their steel arms reaching high into the sky. These were not simple wooden derricks like they had seen in small ports. These were modern industrial cranes, each capable of lifting 15 tons at a time. The prisoners watched in silence as the cranes moved with smooth precision, loading and unloading cargo from multiple ships at once. Electric motors hummed across the waterfront. Cargo loaders ran on tracks, moving containers and supplies with mechanical efficiency. The dock workers operated the machinery with practiced ease, coordinating complex operations that would have taken 3 times as many men working by hand. As the ship moved closer to its berth, the Germans could see the warehouses. They were enormous buildings made of steel and concrete, stretching over 400 meters along the wharf. Through open doors, they glimpsed electric forklifts moving pallets. They saw refrigerated storage units keeping food fresh. The scale of it all was staggering. Hans Schmidt, a former dock worker from Hamburg, gripped the rail until his knuckles turned white. He had worked in one of Germany's busiest ports before the war. He knew what modern port facilities looked like. This was at least equal to Hamburg, possibly better. How was that possible? This was supposed to be wilderness. This was supposed to be a colonial backwater, barely capable of feeding itself. The other prisoners began muttering to each other in low voices. Some pointed at the electric rail lines they could see running behind the warehouses. Others stared at the rows of trucks parked in organized lots, their paint fresh and their engines modern. Everything looked new. Everything looked maintained. Everything looked efficient. This was not the exhausted, struggling colony they had been told about. The guards ordered them to be quiet and line up for disembarkation, but the confusion and shock on their faces was clear. Some of the men exchanged glances that asked the same silent question. If the propaganda had been wrong about this, what else had they been lied to? Wilhelm Müller stood near the back of the group, his mind racing. He had been a teacher in Bremen before being conscripted. He had taught geography to children, showing them maps of the world and explaining how different countries worked. He had taught them that Germany needed more space because their land was too small and their resources too limited. He had taught them that the British Empire was crumbling. Now, looking at this harbor, doubt crept into his mind like cold water. This did not look like a crumbling empire. This looked like a place that was building and growing and succeeding. As the prisoners filed down the gangplank onto Australian soil, every man carried the same unsettling feeling. Something was very different from what they had been told. What they would discover over the coming days would shatter everything they believed. The prisoners spent their first night in a temporary holding facility near the harbor. The next morning, they were loaded onto trains for the journey inland to Cowra Camp in New South Wales. The train ride would cover 225 miles through the Australian countryside. As the locomotive pulled out of the station, the German prisoners pressed against the windows, watching the landscape roll past. What they saw during that journey continued to shake everything they thought they knew. The rail line itself was the first surprise. It was electrified, with power lines running alongside the tracks. The train moved smoothly and quickly, maintained by what was clearly a well-organized railway system. Through the windows, they saw station after station, each one clean and organized with modern platforms. At one stop, Hans Schmidt counted the freight cars sitting in a rail yard. He counted once, then counted again to make sure. 847 freight cars in a single yard. He had worked near the Hamburg rail yards for years and had never seen that many cars in one place. Germany's entire rail system was straining under the demands of war, with constant shortages of rolling stock. Yet here in Australia, hundreds of freight cars sat waiting for cargo, as if they had so many that some could just rest idle. The countryside itself looked nothing like the barren desert they expected. They passed through farmland that stretched to the horizon. The fields were organized and productive, with modern equipment visible near farm buildings. They saw tractors, irrigation systems, and grain silos that towered over the landscape. Cattle grazed in vast paddocks, thousands of animals, fat and healthy. Wilhelm Müller stared out the window and thought about his family back in Bremen. His wife's last letter had mentioned that meat was now rationed to 100 grams per person per week. His children were growing up hungry, yet here he was looking at more cattle than he had seen in his entire life, all of them clearly well fed. When they finally arrived at Cowra camp, the prisoners expected to see a rough collection of tents or basic wooden barracks. Instead, they found a purpose-built facility that had been constructed in just 4 months. The camp was designed to hold 4,000 prisoners and already housed over 2,000. Guard towers stood at the corners, and barbed wire marked the perimeter. But inside those boundaries was something the Germans had not anticipated. Every building had electric lighting, not oil lamps or candles, but actual electric lights powered by generators and a connection to the regional power grid. The barracks buildings were solid wood construction with real floors and weatherproof walls. Each building had a hot water system that delivered warm water for washing. The prisoners had not had regular access to hot water since before they were captured. The camp's hospital amazed the German medics among the prisoners. It was a real medical facility with examination rooms, a surgery area, and equipment including an X-ray machine. An X-ray machine in a prisoner of war camp. Some German civilian hospitals did not have such equipment. The pharmacy was stocked with medicines and supplies. The Australian medical officers treated injuries and illnesses with the same care they gave their own soldiers. When Kurt Weber, a former engineer, saw the hospital, he wrote in his diary that night that something was deeply wrong with what they had been taught. If Australia could afford to give prisoners this level of medical care, how wealthy must this country actually be? But nothing prepared the prisoners for the industrial kitchen. When they were first shown the facility, many of them simply stopped and stared. The kitchen was a massive operation capable of producing 12,000 meals every single day. It had 8 commercial ovens, each one large enough to roast meat for hundreds of men at once. 4 steam kettles sat in a row, each one holding 200 liters. Electric meat slicers cut through roasts with mechanical precision. Refrigeration units hummed constantly, keeping 3 tons of food fresh and ready. The kitchen staff moved through the space with practiced efficiency, preparing meals on a scale that rivaled military operations back in Germany. Hans Schmidt, watching through a window during a tour, felt a knot form in his stomach. This single prison camp kitchen had better equipment than the military mess halls he had eaten in while serving the Reich. Then came the food itself. The prisoners received their first weekly rations and could not believe what they were seeing. Each man received 3 kilograms and 200 grams of meat per week. 3 kilograms. Wilhelm Müller sat on his bunk that first night, holding the ration ticket in his hand, and did the math in his head. His family in Bremen received perhaps 1 kilogram of meat per month, if they were lucky, split between 5 people. He was receiving more than 3 times that amount every single week, just for himself. The rations also included 2 kilograms and 100 grams of bread, 450 grams of butter, 340 grams of sugar, and unlimited vegetables from the camp gardens. The prisoners ate better as captives than they had as soldiers. They ate better than their families at home. In September 1942, 10 months after their arrival, something happened that became legend among the German prisoners. The kitchen staff served ice cream for dessert. Real ice cream made with cream and sugar, cold and sweet. Many of the prisoners had not tasted ice cream in over 18 months. Some of the younger soldiers had not had ice cream since before the war started. Wilhelm Müller wrote in his diary that night that he sat with his bowl of ice cream and cried. Not from joy, but from the terrible understanding of what it meant. Where his children went hungry in Germany, he sat in an enemy prison camp eating ice cream. What did that say about which side was actually winning this war? The monthly delivery from the Coca-Cola company brought 2,400 bottles to the camp canteen. The prisoners could buy bottles of Coca-Cola, chocolate bars, cigarettes, and other goods with the small wages they earned from work details. A Coca-Cola truck arriving at a prison camp like it was a normal delivery route. Ernst Hoffmann watched the truck unload its cargo and shook his head. He had not seen a Coca-Cola since 1939. Most consumer goods had disappeared from German stores years ago. Everything went to the war effort. Yet here in Australia, civilian trucks delivered luxury goods to enemy prisoners. Some prisoners were assigned to work details at nearby industrial sites. This was when the final pieces of their worldview began to crack. A group of men, including Kurt Weber, were taken to work at the Broken Hill Proprietary Steelworks. What they saw there stunned them into silence. The blast furnaces produced 850 tons of steel every single day. The facility used automated conveyor systems, electric arc furnaces, and modern safety equipment. The scale and efficiency matched Germany's famous Krupp steelworks. Kurt Weber had toured Krupp before the war as part of his engineering studies. He knew what German industrial might look like. Yet here was a single Australian steel facility matching the output of one of Germany's premier industrial operations. He wrote in his journal that this single facility produced as much steel per square kilometer as entire sections of the Ruhr Valley. Christmas Day, 1942, marked the moment when everything truly changed for the German prisoners at Kaura camp. The men woke that morning expecting nothing special. Christmas in a prison camp would be just another day of routine and loneliness, or so they thought. But the Australian camp administration had different plans. The kitchen staff had been preparing for days, and when the prisoners lined up for their midday meal, they could smell something wonderful cooking. The scent of roasting meat filled the air, rich and savory in a way that brought back memories of home and better times. Each prisoner received 400 grams of roasted turkey on his plate, 400 grams of meat in a single meal. Alongside the turkey came roasted potatoes, carrots, peas, and gravy made from real turkey drippings. For dessert, the kitchen served plum pudding, a traditional British Christmas treat made with dried fruits, spices, and brandy. Each man also received a bottle of beer with his meal. The prisoners sat at their tables in the mess hall, staring at the food in front of them. Some began eating slowly, savoring every bite. Others ate quickly, as if the food might disappear if they waited too long. Many simply sat in silence, struggling with feelings they could not quite name. But the food was not the end of it. In the afternoon, a group of Australian civilian volunteers arrived at the camp. These were local people from nearby towns, farmers and shopkeepers and their families who had decided to bring Christmas gifts to the prisoners. They carried boxes filled with tobacco, books, handmade items, and small luxuries. The volunteers moved through the campgrounds, handing out gifts and speaking kindly to the German prisoners. Some volunteers spoke broken German. Others communicated through gestures and smiles. The prisoners accepted the gifts with awkward gratitude, unsure how to respond to such unexpected kindness. Hans Schmidt received a tin of tobacco and a book of Australian poetry translated into German. He held these items in his hands and felt something break inside him. These people were the enemy. Germany was at war with their nation and their allies. German submarines had sunk Australian ships. German planes had killed Australian soldiers. Yet here were Australian civilians bringing him gifts on Christmas Day, treating him with more kindness than his own officers had shown him in the barracks back home. That night, Hans wrote in his diary the words that would define his transformation. He wrote that today he understood something important. They had been told Australia was weak because it was soft. They had been told that kindness was weakness and that only harsh discipline created strength. But sitting in his bunk that night, full of good food and holding gifts from enemy civilians, Hans realized they had been completely wrong. Australia was not strong despite being kind. It was strong because it was kind. A nation that could afford to treat its enemies this well, that could feed its prisoners better than Germany fed its own, soldiers, that had civilians who felt safe and prosperous enough to give gifts to enemy captives, that was the nation that was truly winning. The camp ran educational programs for prisoners who wanted to learn. The Australians believed that education and fair treatment might help rehabilitate men who had been raised under Nazi propaganda. The camp library had technical books, engineering manuals, agricultural science texts, and manufacturing journals. Prisoners could request books and spend their evenings reading and learning. Ernst Hoffmann, who had been a farmer before the war, discovered agricultural science texts that changed everything he thought he knew about farming. He read that Australian farmers achieved wheat yields of 1.4 tons per hectare using modern techniques, crop rotation, and scientific farming methods. German farmers averaged only 9/10 of a ton per hectare. The numbers did not lie. Ernst sat in the library night after night, reading everything he could find about Australian agriculture. He learned about soil science, irrigation efficiency, mechanical harvesters, and hybrid seed varieties. The bitter realization settled over him like a cold fog. The entire Nazi ideology of Lebensraum, the idea that Germany needed to conquer more land because they did not have enough space to feed their people, was built on a lie. Germany did not need more land. Germany needed better farming methods. The Australians proved it. They produced more food per hectare with fewer workers, using scientific methods and modern equipment. Germany had sent millions of men to die conquering territory in the east, claiming they needed the land to survive. But the real problem was not the amount of land. The real problem was how they used it. Ernst thought about all the death and destruction, all the villages burned and people killed, all in pursuit of land they did not actually need. The waste of it all made him feel sick. Some prisoners were assigned to work on local farms to help with labor shortages caused by Australian men serving in the military. This brought them into direct contact with ordinary Australian families. Kurt Weber was assigned to work on a sheep station owned by a family named Morrison. The Morrisons treated Kurt fairly paying him the agreed wages, and including him in the daily routines of farm life. One evening, Mr. Morrison invited Kurt to join the family for dinner in their home. Kurt accepted, uncertain what to expect. He entered the Morrison farmhouse and felt like he had stepped into another world. The home had electric lights in every room. A refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, keeping food fresh. A radio sat in the living room, and after dinner, Mr. Morrison turned it on to listen to the evening news. Mrs. Morrison served the meal on matching dishes, and there was plenty of food for everyone, including Kurt. After dinner, Kurt noticed a car parked outside, a relatively new model in good condition. This was the Morrison family car, used for trips to town and visiting neighbors. Kurt sat in the living room with the Morrisons, drinking tea and listening to the radio. An understanding crashed over him like a wave. The Morrisons were average people. Mr. Morrison was a farmer, not a wealthy businessman or government official. He was the Australian equivalent of the small farmers Kurt had known back in Germany. Yet this average Australian farming family lived better than German middle-class professionals had before the war. They had electricity, a refrigerator, a radio, a car, and plenty of food. They lived in a comfortable home on their own land, safe and secure. Kurt thought about his family back in Germany, about his father who had been a school principal, a respected professional. His father's home had not been as comfortable as this farmhouse. His father had not owned a car. Very few German families had refrigerators before the war. The comparison was devastating. The camp received Australian newspapers several times a week. The prisoners could read about the war's progress and learn about world events. At first, many dismissed the newspapers as propaganda, no different from what they had received in Germany. But as the months passed and they could verify certain facts through letters from home and other sources, they began to realize the newspapers were mostly telling the truth. The papers published production figures showing how many ships, planes, tanks, and guns the Allies were building. The numbers were staggering. The United States alone was producing more war material than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. Australia's own production was small compared to America, but still impressive for a nation of only 7 million people. Kurt Weber read these figures carefully, checking them against his own observations. He had seen the steelworks producing 850 tons per day. He had seen the harbour facilities in Sydney. He had watched modern trucks and tractors operating across the countryside. The numbers in the newspapers matched what he could see with his own eyes. And if the production numbers were true, then the other information was probably true as well. Information about German defeats in Russia, information about Allied victories in North Africa, information about the true state of the war. Kurt wrote in his journal one night, struggling to find the right words for what he was feeling. He wrote that everything he had believed about the Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy and degenerate democracies had been projection. Germany had been the one living under lies. Germany had been the one following a degenerate ideology. They had called others weak while pursuing a path that could only lead to destruction. The camp hospital provided medical care that saved lives. When prisoners became seriously ill or injured, they received the same treatment Australian soldiers received. In 1943, penicillin became available in Australia. This new medicine was a miracle drug that could cure infections that had killed people for all of human history. Penicillin was so new that most German hospitals did not have access to it yet. But Australian military doctors used it to treat sick prisoners. 3 German prisoners contracted serious infections that would have been death sentences just a few years earlier. The Australian doctors administered penicillin, and all three men recovered fully. The prisoners carried these questions with them every day, knowing that someday they would return home. When that day came, they would carry more than just questions. They would carry the truth about what they had seen. The war ended in May 1945 with Germany's complete defeat. For the German prisoners in Australia, the news brought mixed feelings. The war was over, which meant the killing would stop. But Germany had lost everything. Their country lay in ruins. Their families had suffered through years of bombing and shortages. Many prisoners had no idea if their homes still stood or if their loved ones had survived. The Australian authorities began the slow process of repatriation, sending prisoners back to Germany in groups over the following 2 years. In 1947, 2,847 German prisoners who had been held in Australia finally boarded ships for the journey home. The voyage back across the oceans took weeks, just as it had coming to Australia. But this time, the prisoners were different men. They had spent years living in a country that treated them fairly, fed them well, and showed them a different way of organizing society. They had worked alongside Australians, eaten meals prepared in industrial kitchens, received medical care that saved their lives, and seen with their own eyes what a prosperous democracy could achieve. Now they were returning to a homeland most of them barely recognized anymore. As the ships approached the German coast, the prisoners crowded on deck to see their country again. What they saw shocked them almost as much as their first sight of Sydney Harbour had years before, but for completely opposite reasons. The ship docked in Hamburg, and Hans Schmidt stood at the rail looking at his home city, or what was left of it. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. Buildings that had stood for centuries were now just broken walls and piles of bricks. Cranes worked to clear debris from the streets, but the damage was so vast that it would take years, maybe decades, to rebuild. The famous harbor that Hans had worked in before the war was damaged and operating at a fraction of its former capacity. The modern equipment and efficient operations he remembered were gone, replaced by desperate improvisation and manual labor. Hans thought about Sydney Harbour with its 15-ton cranes and 400-meter warehouses, all of it untouched by war. The contrast made his chest feel tight. The returning prisoners were processed through reception centers and given temporary housing assignments. See, food was scarce throughout Germany. The official ration was 1,200 calories per day per person, barely enough to survive on. 3,200,000 people were homeless, living in damaged buildings or temporary shelters. The prisoners walked through streets filled with rubble and saw women and children digging through ruins, looking for anything useful. Old people sat on broken steps with blank expressions, too tired and hungry to show emotion. Hans Schmidt made his way to his old neighborhood, hoping his family home had survived. When he reached the street where he had grown up, his legs almost gave out beneath him. The entire block was gone. Just foundations and rubble remained. His childhood home, the house where his parents had lived, the place that had held all his memories, was simply not there anymore. He stood in the ruins and thought about the intact suburbs he had seen in Australia, the comfortable homes with electric lights and modern appliances, the streets that had never known bombs or fire. The unfairness of it crushed down on him like a physical weight. Wilhelm Müller found his family living in 3 rooms of a partially destroyed apartment building. His wife and children had survived, which made him weep with relief. But they were thin and tired, worn down by years of hunger and fear. His oldest daughter, who had been 12 when he last saw her, was now 17 and looked like an old woman. His son had rickets from malnutrition, causing his legs to bow. The family shared their rations carefully, making every gram of food last as long as possible. That first night, sitting with his family around a small table, Wilhelm tried to eat the watery soup his wife had prepared. He thought about the 3 kilograms and 200 grams of meat he had received every week in Cowra camp. He thought about the ice cream and the Christmas turkey and the bottles of Coca-Cola. The guilt was overwhelming. His family had starved while he ate better than he ever had in his life. How could he tell them that? How could he explain that the enemy had treated him better than his own country had treated them? The returning prisoners brought more than just memories back to Germany. They brought knowledge and skills learned during their captivity. Hans Schmidt had learned modern dock management techniques watching the Sydney Harbour operations. Kurt Weber had studied Australian industrial processes at the steelworks. Ernst Hoffmann had read everything he could find about scientific farming methods. These men began quietly sharing what they had learned with others. Ernst taught his neighbors about crop rotation and soil management. Kurt found work at a factory being rebuilt and suggested organizational changes based on what he had seen in Australia. They did not speak much about their time as prisoners because the contrast was too painful, and many Germans did not want to hear about how well the Allies had treated enemy captives. But the knowledge they brought back slowly spread through their communities. Of the prisoners who returned from Australia, 347 officially documented their desire to emigrate back to Australia when the opportunity arose. Many more felt the same way but said nothing, knowing such talk could seem disloyal. Ernst Hoffmann was one of the 347. He told his wife about Australia, about the modern farms and the fair treatment and the opportunities for a better life. She listened to his stories and saw the hope in his eyes for the first time since he had come home. Together they made a plan. Ernst worked whatever jobs he could find and saved every pfennig. His wife took in washing and mending to earn extra money. They saved for 6 years, living on almost nothing, putting every bit of spare money aside. In 1953, Ernst and his family boarded a ship bound for Australia. 142 other former prisoners eventually made the same journey, bringing their families to start new lives in the country where they had once been captives. Ernst stood on the deck of the ship as it left Hamburg, watching Germany disappear behind them. His children stood beside him, excited and nervous about the journey ahead. His oldest son asked him why they were leaving Germany. Ernst thought carefully about how to answer. He told his son that he wanted them to grow up in a place where prosperity was built on cooperation instead of conquest. He wanted them to live in a country where people had enough to eat and opportunities to learn and succeed. He wanted them to see that there was a better way to organize society, a way that created wealth instead of destroying it, a way that lifted people up instead of crushing them down. His son did not fully understand, but he nodded and held his father's hand. Ernst felt the ship carrying them toward a future he had once thought impossible back when he was a young soldier who believed everything his government told him. The experiences of the German prisoners who returned from Australia had a small but meaningful impact on post-war German society. They became voices for change, advocating for trade unions, democratic reforms, and modern industrial practices. Their testimonies were used in denazification programs to show Germans what Allied countries were actually like, stripping away the propaganda and lies. Kurt Weber spoke at several of these programs, telling audiences about the steelworks and the hospitals and the fair treatment. He told them that strength was not measured in tanks or terror. He told them what he had learned in Australia, that real national power came from what a country could build when its people were free and educated and given the chance to contribute. Some people listened, many did not want to hear it, but the seeds were planted. In June 1945, just after Germany surrendered, Kurt Weber wrote one final entry in the diary he had kept throughout his captivity. He wrote that in Australia he had learned the difference between power and strength. Power destroys things to prove itself. Power conquers and controls through fear. Strength creates things. Strength builds and organizes and lifts people up. Germany had pursued power and created wastelands. Australia had built strength and created a civilization in what Germans would have called wilderness. That was the lesson Kurt learned as a prisoner of war. Real victory was not measured in territory conquered or enemies killed. Real victory was measured in what you built, what you created, and how you treated even the people who had tried to destroy you. By 1950, just 5 years after the war ended, Australia, with its population of 7.5 million people, was producing more steel per person than Germany, with 68 million people, had produced in 1939. The backwater colony had outbuilt the industrial giant. The weak democracy had proven stronger than the mighty Reich. The German prisoners of war had been the first to witness this truth, seeing it with their own eyes in the harbor cranes and factory floors and dinner tables of their captors. Some of them spent the rest of their lives trying to explain what they had learned. That real strength comes not from conquest, but from creation. Not from fear, but from fairness. Not from destroying others, but from building something worth protecting. The prisoners had learned this lesson in Australian camps. The question that haunted Kurt Weber until his death in 1983 was whether the world had learned it yet. He feared the answer was no, but he never stopped hoping the answer might someday be yes.